It was the kind of summer night in Montana where the silence feels older than the mountains themselves. Ovando, a tiny town with fewer than 100 souls, lay tucked under a sky so dark that the stars looked almost too sharp to be real. To most, this was paradise. The hum of the Blackfoot River nearby, the scent of pine drifting lazily through campgrounds, and the easy rhythm of a place untouched by the chaos of city life. For Leah Davis Loken, a 65-year-old avid cyclist and hiker from California, this was more than just a pit stop. It was a chance to live the kind of quiet adventure that only the road and a bicycle can offer. She had spent the day riding with friends along Montana's famed cycling routes, pushing through rolling hills and open fields until their legs ached in the best possible way. That evening, she and two fellow cyclists decided to camp in the small designated area right in town. The tents went up, the bikes were leaned against trees, and the night unfolded with laughter and the easy camaraderie of the road. But the wilderness in Montana isn't just scenery. It's alive, unpredictable, and always watching. Sometime before midnight, a shadow moved between the trees at the edge of the campground. It was a grizzly bear, a full-grown, heavy-shouldered creature whose presence could shift the air from calm to electric in a heartbeat. The bear wandered close, sniffing out the strange mix of human scents, the faint trace of food, the leather of bike seats, the lingering salt of sweat. Leah and the others woke to the sound, branches shifting, the unmistakable huff of something large. They clambered out, hearts thudding, and together they managed to scare it off. Shouts, clanging metal, waving arms, enough to send the bear retreating into the dark. When it vanished, the group exhaled as if they'd pressed pause on danger. They talked it over in hushed tones, convincing themselves that the encounter was over, that the bear had learned to keep its distance. Still, there was an unease that settled like a thin frost. Leah, experienced in the outdoors, understood the risks, but also trusted the code that most wild animals follow. Confrontation avoided is confrontation over. She crawled back into her tent, zipping the thin nylon shut, the sound almost absurdly fragile in the memory of that deep, guttural breathing. Around them, the town slept. Streetlights cast faint amber halos on the gravel road, and somewhere far off, a train's low horn threaded through the stillness. Minutes slipped into hours. Inside the tent, Leah shifted on her sleeping pad, the day's exhaustion mingling with the echo of adrenaline. She could not have known that the bear had not moved on, that somewhere in the dark it paused, circled, and began its slow return, driven by hunger, curiosity, or something older and more dangerous than either. In the kind of silence that only predators understand, it was coming back. The quiet had become almost absolute, the kind of stillness that convinces the human mind that danger has passed. But in the cold logic of the wild, time means nothing. The grizzly was back, padding silently through the shadows, its massive paws barely disturbing the dry grass. In the darkness, the animal's world was painted in scent and sound, human smells pulling it forward, heartbeat after heartbeat. For Leah, the night air was cool enough to warrant pulling the sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. She stirred faintly at a noise, a faint crunch, like gravel shifting under weight. She didn't yet open her eyes. The bear's approach was patient. It passed the edge of the campground, keeping to the thin veil of darkness beyond the dim spill of streetlight. The tents stood like small, soft-walled fortresses, each holding the vulnerable stillness of sleeping humans. The grizzly's breathing was deep and steady. It slowed near Leah's tent, its snout lifting to draw in the air. The scent of a human at rest, the faint residue of food from earlier in the day, the sharp tang of sweat, all told it that here, inside this thin fabric, was something worth investigating. Leah's eyes snapped open as she heard a heavy exhale just outside her head. Adrenaline hit instantly, cold and electrifying. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice sharp and cutting the night. Her friends in nearby tents stirred, one fumbling for a flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark, catching the gleam of two reflective eyes just feet from her tent. There was no growl, no warning, just the terrible realization that the bear had no fear left in it. In that frozen moment, time seemed to warp. Leah's mind flickered through survival instincts. Make yourself big, make noise. But she was already horizontal, zipped inside a cocoon of nylon. The bear moved, a slow, decisive step forward. Her friends shouted now, the urgency in their voices like flares in the dark. The bear's massive head pushed against the tent wall, the thin fabric pressing in toward her face. Then, in a sudden burst, it was inside, ripping through the barrier like paper. The smell was overwhelming, fur, earth, and something primal. Chaos erupted. Leah's cries mixed with her friends' shouts, the tent collapsing in a flurry of movement. The bear's sheer power was undeniable, every motion heavy, inevitable. One friend charged forward, swinging a can of bear spray, the mist clouding in the air. The grizzly recoiled, but not far, its bulk looming, indecisive for only a heartbeat. Then it lunged again, the attack now a brutal reality. The night air, moments ago calm, was alive with the sound of a struggle no human strength could win. In the small Montana town, under the blanket of stars, the wild had come crashing through the fragile walls between human and predator. And Leah, in the center of it, was fighting for her life. The air inside the collapsed tent was suffocating, thick with nylon, dust, and the musky heat of the bear's fur. Leah's screams sliced through the night, a raw sound that was part fear, part defiance. The grizzly's weight crushed the ground beneath it, every shift of its body pressing into her with bone-deep force. Outside, the campground had exploded into motion, her friends shouting, flashlights swinging wildly, one of them fumbling to re-aim the bear spray through the sagging layers of fabric. The hiss of aerosol filled the air again, a cloud of sharp, stinging chemicals meant to drive the predator away. The bear pulled back a fraction, shaking its head, but the retreat was brief. It seemed to have locked onto something, an ancient, unshakable instinct to finish what it had started. The nylon walls of the tent hung in ribbons now, opening the space to the cold night air. The light from the flashlight caught the ripple of muscle beneath the grizzly's fur, the glint of its teeth as it moved with terrible purpose. Leah's friends were yelling her name now, their voices cracking with panic. One grabbed a nearby cooler and hurled it toward the bear. The crash was loud, jarring in the stillness, and for a heartbeat it worked. The grizzly paused, swiveling its massive head toward the source of the noise. That was enough for Leah to move, trying to crawl free, but the bear lunged again, pinning her down with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She fought, clawing at the ground, kicking, every instinct screaming to get away. In the dim light, the scene was frantic and unreal. The bear spray canister was nearly empty now, its last bursts weak against the predator's resolve. Leah's friends were too close, too desperate to think of safety. They were trying anything to distract the animal, but the grizzly's focus was absolute. Then came the moment that shifted everything, a deep, guttural roar, the kind that vibrates through your chest and freezes thought. It was the sound of dominance, of an apex predator, unwilling to yield. The bear surged forward again, and this time the attack was final. The sounds that followed were not the sharp cries of a struggle, but the heavy, terrible movements of something that had crossed the line from confrontation to kill. The flashlight beam trembled in unsteady hands, catching fragments, Leah's unmoving form, the bear's powerful shoulders, the churn of dirt beneath them. In the distance, somewhere in the sleeping town, a dog began to bark, sharp and relentless, as though sensing the violence in the air. And then, as abruptly as it began, the bear stopped. It stood over her for a long, awful moment, breathing hard, its sides rising and falling in the cold light. With a final glance at the shouting, advancing humans, it turned and vanished into the dark, its massive form melting into the black edges of the night, leaving only silence in its wake. For several long seconds, no one moved. The darkness seemed heavier now, like the night itself had shifted in weight. Leah's friends were frozen, hearts pounding, unable to reconcile what had just unfolded. The bear was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, a primal tension, the invisible echo of something too big, too violent to fade quickly. The only sounds were the distant bark of the dog, the nervous calls of a few waking townsfolk, and the ragged breathing of those who had been inside the chaos. Then reality came rushing in. One of Leah's companions dropped to their knees beside her, calling her name in a voice that cracked like splintered wood. The flashlight beam found her face, still pale, impossibly still. They shouted for help, the urgency in their voices tearing through the quiet streets of Ovando. Within minutes, porch lights flickered on. Doors opened, shapes emerged from the shadows, some barefoot, some clutching coats against the chill, all drawn by the frantic cries. Someone sprinted toward the only phone in reach, another toward a pickup truck, but in a town this small, emergency response was never immediate. Leah's friends tried everything, compressions, whispered pleas, the desperate pressure of human hands against the irreversible. But the damage was too great. When the first responders finally arrived, the looks on their faces told the story before the words came. Leah Davis Loken, 65 years old, cyclist, hiker, adventurer, had been lost in the heart of a place she loved. The scene was surreal under the hard white light of headlamps and flashlights. The shredded remains of the tent flapped faintly in the night breeze. A bike leaned nearby, untouched, but spattered with dirt from the scuffle. Footprints, human and animal, crisscrossed the ground, each telling fragments of the violent minutes that had passed. The grizzly's tracks were unmistakable, deep impressions in the soil, each one a reminder of the power that had moved through this space. News of the attack spread through the town in waves. For the people of Ovando, bears were part of the landscape, as familiar as the mountains themselves. But this was different. This was a predator breaking the unspoken rules, returning after being driven away, crossing that fragile line between avoidance and aggression. The implications settled heavily on everyone who heard the details. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond the edge of town, the bear was still moving. Perhaps it had stopped to rest, or perhaps it was still circling, driven by instincts older than human memory. For the wildlife officials now being called in from across the region, there was no question about what came next. A bear that had killed once, and so brazenly, would almost certainly do so again. The hunt to track and stop it had already begun, even as the campground lay in silent ruin. By dawn, Ovando was no longer the same sleepy Montana town it had been just hours earlier. The soft blush of sunrise spilled over the mountains, but it did nothing to erase the memory of the night's violence. Wildlife officials arrived with grim efficiency, stepping carefully around the scene, their boots pressing into the same earth where predator and prey had collided. The air smelled faintly of smoke from someone's morning fire, but underneath lingered that raw, almost metallic scent left in the wake of blood and fear. Leah's campsite was now a point of forensic attention. The investigators moved methodically, photographing the torn tent, marking the bear's tracks, collecting any trace evidence that could confirm the animal's identity. A claw mark on a nearby log. Tufts of coarse brown hair caught in the fabric of the tent's shredded doorway. These were more than clues. They were the signatures of the predator they would now have to find. Wildlife agents briefed the locals who had gathered in small, tight-lipped clusters. There was no room for ambiguity. The bear responsible was dangerous, and it was likely still close. Grizzlies, they explained, didn't typically linger after such encounters, but a bear that had returned once, after being scared away, was a different kind of threat. They would use trained trackers, scent dogs, and even aerial surveillance to locate it. The objective was clear: find and remove the bear before it could strike again. As the search began, the edges of Ovando blurred into wilderness almost immediately. Dense pine forests, thickets of underbrush, and winding trails gave the animal countless hiding places. The trackers studied the ground with a patience honed by years in the field, reading the faint depressions of paw prints and noting where branches had been pushed aside by a heavy body passing through. The dogs moved in tight zigzags, noses low, pulling at their leads with sudden bursts of certainty before the scent thinned again. Meanwhile, Leah's fellow cyclists remained in shock. Their gear was packed away now, but not with the casual anticipation of another day's ride. It was hurried, mechanical, their faces pale under the morning light. The weight of what they had witnessed pressed down in silence. A coffee cup sat untouched on a nearby picnic table, steam curling into the cool air before disappearing entirely. As hours passed, the hunt pushed deeper into the surrounding hills. Reports trickled in, a sighting near a creek bed, a trail of overturned rocks where the bear had foraged, the unmistakable print of claws in damp soil. Each clue tightened the net. The people of Ovando waited, aware that the outcome was inevitable. In the wild, a predator that had broken the rules could not be left to roam freely, not in a landscape where human life brushed so closely against wilderness. By late afternoon, the trackers closed in on a ravine thick with willows and chokecherry bushes. The dogs barked sharply, their voices echoing in the narrow cut of land. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the tangle of green, the bear that had changed this town forever was waiting. The air grew still again, heavy with the same tension that had hung over the campground the night before. Only this time, it was the hunters who would move first. The ravine was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the trackers advanced, their boots sinking into the soft earth. Every step was deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid snapping a twig or sending a cascade of pebbles down the slope. The scent dogs strained forward, their noses twitching furiously, the sound of their breathing loud in the hush. Somewhere in that dense patch of willows and chokecherries, a pair of dark eyes might already be watching them. The lead wildlife officer raised a hand, signaling the team to slow. He'd seen it. A shadow where there should have been none, a subtle shift of shape against the green. The bear was there, crouched low, muscles coiled, its fur blending with the earth and brush. For a moment, predator and hunter regarded each other, the space between them charged with something older than civilization itself. The bear moved first. It erupted from the cover with terrifying speed, a blur of muscle and raw power. The ground shook beneath its charge, the air filled with the deep guttural sound of its breath. The officers didn't hesitate. The sharp crack of a rifle split the silence, echoing up the ravine walls. The first shot struck true, halting the momentum, but not the will of the grizzly. It stumbled, growled, and surged forward again. Another shot followed, and then another. The massive animal collapsed into the brush, the sudden stillness almost as shocking as the violence of the attack. The officers held their positions, weapons trained, waiting for movement that didn't come. The dogs fell silent, ears back, their bodies tense but unmoving. Slowly, the team advanced, confirming what they already knew. The bear was dead. It was a sobering sight. Up close, the grizzly was even larger than it had seemed in the darkness of the campground. Its paws were broad enough to cover a man's face, claws curved and sharp as blades. The thick fur was matted from the struggle, and its weight pressed the undergrowth flat beneath it. In the fading afternoon light, it looked less like a monster and more like what it truly was, a wild creature acting on instinct, colliding fatally with the human world. The officers worked quickly, taking samples and photographs, documenting every detail for the official record. The bear's teeth and claws would be measured, its DNA compared to the evidence from the campsite. The case would be closed with certainty. This was the same animal that had entered Ovando, ignored warnings, and taken a human life. When the team began the trek back to town, the mood was heavy. They had done what had to be done, but there was no satisfaction in it. In the distance, the sun dipped lower, casting the mountains in gold and shadow. Ovando would return to its rhythm in the days ahead, but the memory of this bear, its first approach, its return, and its final stand, would remain etched into the town's history. The news traveled faster than the river that wound through Ovando. By evening, every porch light seemed to burn a little longer, as if holding back the darkness itself. Word spread that the bear had been found and killed, but instead of relief, the town felt something heavier, a mix of sorrow, inevitability, and the quiet knowledge that in the wild, there are no true victories. Leah's name was on everyone's lips, spoken softly in grocery aisles, over gas station counters, and around kitchen tables. She wasn't just another visitor passing through. She had shared stories, laughter, and the open-road spirit that cyclists carry like a badge of honor. The campground, now empty, had become a kind of unspoken memorial. The grass still showed the flattened shapes where tents had been pitched. A forgotten tent stake glinted in the dirt, catching the last of the day's light. Someone had placed a small bouquet of wildflowers near the spot where Leah's tent once stood. Purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam root, their colors defiant against the backdrop of green and brown. Wildlife officials met with residents in the community hall, explaining every detail they could. The bear's repeated return, the behavior that marked it as unusually dangerous, the necessity of the lethal decision. They spoke in calm, steady voices, but the weight of the story hung in the room like a storm cloud. Some nodded quietly, accepting the harsh reality of living alongside apex predators. Others sat stiffly, their eyes fixed on the floor, troubled by the idea that something so magnificent could be brought down. For Leah's cycling companions, the day felt endless. They replayed the night's events in their minds, searching for some different choice, some path that might have led to a different outcome. But the truth was as unyielding as the mountains around them. The bear had come back, and once it had, the ending had been set in motion. That night, the streets of Ovando were quieter than usual. The stars returned in their unbroken canopy, and the moon traced silver across the Blackfoot River. But the beauty of it all carried a shadow now. The wilderness here wasn't just scenery, it was a force, one that could awe and destroy in the same breath. As the town settled into an uneasy rest, a new silence took hold, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after a story has ended, leaving behind only the echoes. Somewhere in that silence, the memory of Leah's laughter still seemed to drift, mingling with the whisper of wind through pine. And though the bear was gone, its presence lingered in the way people glanced at the tree line, in the way the darkness seemed just a little deeper than before. In the days that followed, Ovando carried on, but not unchanged. Travelers still rolled into town, cyclists chasing the Great Divide route, hikers looking for solitude, but each was greeted with quiet warnings now. Be bear aware, signs reminded at trailheads and campgrounds, their messages suddenly more than routine. Locals spoke with the kind of measured caution that comes from lived experience, passing along advice about food storage, noise, and the thin line between safety and risk. Leah's story became part of that guidance, not in gruesome detail, but in the essential truth, that even seasoned adventurers, even those who respect the wild, can be caught in its unpredictable turn. Her name appeared in cycling forums and outdoor groups across the country, a cautionary tale told with a mix of reverence and disbelief. She was remembered not for the way her life ended, but for the way she lived it, on two wheels, under open skies, and with an eagerness to explore. A memorial ride was organized weeks later, drawing cyclists from miles around. They pedaled into Ovando in long, winding lines, their tires humming over asphalt and gravel. Some wore bright jerseys, others plain, but all carried her spirit in the rhythm of their ride. They stopped at the campground, dismounting in silence, and placed flowers, notes, and small tokens, bike bells, a pair of worn gloves, a folded trail map. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of pine through the still air. Meanwhile, the official reports were finalized. DNA confirmed what everyone already knew. The grizzly taken down in the ravine was the same one that had entered town that night. The documents outlined its size, weight, condition, and behavior. It was, by all accounts, a healthy animal, its aggression not born of illness or desperation, but a learned boldness. Somewhere in its encounters with humans, it had crossed the invisible boundary and found no reason to turn back. For the wildlife officers, the case closed without celebration. Their work was not about triumph, but about balance, a balance that sometimes required irreversible decisions. For Ovando, the experience deepened the respect they already held for the wild. It was a reminder that in this place, where civilization presses against the edges of untamed land, coexistence comes with risks that cannot be erased. Leah's friends eventually left Montana, their bikes carrying them toward new miles and new landscapes. But none would forget the night in Ovando, the sharp edge of fear, or the way the darkness had seemed to move with intent. They carried the memory like a weight and a compass, shaping the way they camped, the way they listened to the night, and the way they spoke about the beauty and danger of the wild. And so, in this corner of Montana, under a sky that will always belong more to the mountains than to men, the story remained, told in low voices around campfires, repeated in warnings to newcomers, remembered in the quiet moments when the wind rustles through the pines. Leah had come here for the freedom of the open road, and though she vanished into the wild's final embrace, her journey would echo here for years to come.